Salams, this is People's Dispatch and you're watching the Daily Debrief. Coming to you from our studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani, and on the show today, Prabir Purkayastha, NewsClick's editor-in-chief, will join us to talk about the G20 foreign ministers meeting that was held in New Delhi. We're talking, of course, about what the G20's original purpose is and how that functions in today's rules-based order, as well as along with the unilateral sanctions that are often imposed on several countries by the West. After that, we go to the US, where the Joe Biden administration has announced the extension of sanctions against Venezuela. And finally, in a major relief for millions in the United States, the drug maker Eli Lilly has capped the price of insulin at $35 a month. There's been a flurry of diplomatic activity in India over the past few weeks, with first the finance ministers and heads of the central banks of the G20 nations, and now the G20 foreign ministers meeting in India's capital. India is, of course, holding the rotational presidency of that informal economic grouping. Talking about events as they unfolded in Delhi, the lack of a joint communique issued at the end of that conference, is Prabir Purkayastha, who looks at these issues quite closely with us, and who will also give us a sense of what the original intended purpose of the G20 actually is. Prabir, welcome back to Daily Debrief. Good to have you with us as always. Some of the reading of this, Prabir, at the foreign ministers meeting, reportage of events as they went down, comes across a little bit like, petulant schoolboys not wanting to take photographs with each other and things like that. But at the end of it, there are, of course, very serious issues. Russia, for example, bringing up events that have happened since Bali, with the Nord Stream sabotage, as well as pulling out of the Minsk agreements. Those things changing the situation on the ground and therefore resulting in a lack of consensus in the end.
If we look at the G20, and the G20, the Foreign Ministers Summit is really the part of what the G20 is supposed to be. The fundamental issue about the G20 is it was not about foreign policy, it was not about international issues, strategic or geostrategic issues, so to say. These were the realm of the United Nations. They were not supposed to come into a G20 kind of conference. And in fact, G20 was supposed to be about the financial and economic structure of the world. I think it was formed in 1998 or so. It was a very low-profile body. It became important in 2008 with the financial crisis. And the G7 at that time, they had still, I think, not thrown out of Russia. So that was G8. Looking at the world and knowing that the financial crisis could not be handled by G8. And they needed the other countries, the big economies in the world, and in fact, the emerging economies in the world, like India, of course, China was already, should have been a part of that anyway.
Yeah.
But also looking at, for instance, countries like Brazil and so on, which are really the large global economies, but not a part of the G7 or G8, or a part, of course, of the United Nations P5, the permanent 5 members. So this was really the genesis of G20. So therefore, bringing in issues like Russia, Ukraine, or if India wants to do, for instance, Kashmir, or India-China border, you can go on multiplying these issues. And then G20's whole, supposedly its focus, or its really what its ambit should be, then becomes everything in the world. And it just becomes then another platform in which you jockey with each other. You want to see who becomes, who gets the brownie points, who gets to be cornered, all of that, for which there are n number of other platforms. So the idea was that there is an economic set of issues in the world on which collaboratively we should be able to solve the problems. So it's a dysfunctional nature of today's global politics that we don't have a platform to discuss these issues and try to resolve them. Instead of that, we have platforms to isolate, corner certain countries, which of course on Ukraine is what we are seeing, trying to corner Russia. Now, of course, the Ukraine issue is not an issue with really, there are clear lines. Let's put it this way. Countries have their differences, and bringing it into G20 is, of course, a prescription for not getting G20 off the ground. Other issues also then sort of fall by the wayside. This becomes the main dividing line, which is what it has been since the Bali. If you saw the ministerial, the presidents finally meet, the head of states finally meeting, it produced no results. So we are seeing a similar state now as well as in G20. So unfortunately, the whole purpose of the G20 has been lost. And this, particularly at a time when the G7, the economic powers, have been overtaken by even the BRICS, 5 countries of the BRICS, in terms of the size of their economies. If you take purchasing power parity, not the external account, which is what the foreign exchange value or the value of a currency, that's what you convert to dollars essentially to see how big your economy is. If you take purchasing power parity, the size of the internal economy, what the economy seems to the people, the BRICS is bigger than today G7. So given all of that, I don't think we see the reflection of all of this in G20. It's become who do we blame? And in this particular case, India is trying to get everybody together. It's an impossible task. This failed in Bali as well. So what we have is a sense of the chair's summary, which doesn't commit anybody to anything. It's essentially India's foreign minister, Jaishankar's summary of the events. Doesn't offer any solutions, condemns Russia for invading Ukraine, which would be a position a lot of the countries, sovereign nations would take, but also does not mean any sanctions, support to any sanctions, or any of the other measures, which is what the West really wants.
Praveen, you mentioned India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar and his kind of role in putting together what hopefully by September, when the heads of state meet, is a joint joint statement where everyone agrees on the language. So a lot of hard work ahead, and maybe looking for a sort of silver lining in the whole situation. He is saying that all the issues faced by the global south have actually been addressed. How far do you find that statement to be accurate, Praveer?
Well, they have been addressed to the extent that he has said something about it. But the fact there is no joint communique itself is not a measure of success. So, yes, on other issues, we have the maybe platitudes on every side. But the real issue still remains the economic sanctions. As long as economic sanctions exist, countries increasingly, a large number of them, have been sanctioned. It's Russia, of course, Belarus, Iran. We can go down the list of countries, Venezuela.
We're talking later in the show about the renewal of US sanctions on Venezuela as well, yeah.
If you go down that route, Cuba, which has been sanctioned from 1960s, if you go down this route, you will find a huge number of countries are under US or Western sanctions.
We'll have to leave it there for today, but thanks very much for your time. In a move that has largely flown under the radar for most major news organizations around the world, and particularly in the United States, the Joe Biden administration has decided to extend a 2015 Barack Obama-era executive order that calls a national state of emergency in Venezuela, and thereby allowing the United States government to place unilateral coercive sanctions on that country. We've discussed often on the show the impact that these sanctions have had, and how even the United Nations has come out and said that these sanctions do not end up solving the problem. They only become a further burden on the people. Natalia Marquez covers the region for People's Dispatch and will join us for 2 stories today. First up, we'll talk about Venezuela as an extension of the conversation we were having with Prabir earlier on the G20 and its functioning. Hi, Natalia. We're talking to begin with about the executive order that just got renewed, effectively extending the unilateral sanctions on Venezuela by another year. This is at a time, Natalia, when with everything happening with Russia, sanctions, etc. On the one hand, the US is trying to diplomatically have conversations or at least engage in some way with Venezuela. On the other hand, we're seeing an extension of sanctions that are bound to have a further crippling effect on the country's economy.
Yeah. sanctions in Venezuela have been, called a violation of international law by UN officials. And yet they were just renewed. Biden just renewed an Obama era executive order declaring a state of national emergency in Venezuela. And, Biden has kept up the brutal, crippling sanctions against Venezuela that Obama and Trump continued as well. So this is something that spans all parties of the United States. Both two major parties are in agreement in that Venezuela needs to be sanctioned. This is a direct attack on the government of Venezuela. It really harms the people of Venezuela, right? So, there is a huge migrant crisis as well of people coming from Venezuela, especially to places like the US. And, even at the US border, the United States is trying to deny as many asylum seekers as possible. But, the migrant crisis is caused directly by sanctions. It's caused by US policy. And so, Biden just instituted some really harsh regulations on asylum seekers, and now with the renewal rather of sanctions, it really shows like a very hostile policy towards the people of Venezuela, where not only can they not survive, live comfortably in their own country, but they also can't even escape. They can't even enter the very country that is sanctioning them.
We were talking a little bit earlier on the show, Natalia, to Prabir Purkayastha, who was talking about, how the existence of this rules-based international order coupled with the sanctions regime will not allow for there ever to be consensus on how to deal with key economic issues that the world is facing. In all of this context, what is the conversation in the US with regard to Venezuela? There is, of course, a solidarity movement, but do the people of the United States know what's going on?
Yeah, well, our article on People's Dispatch is really one of the only articles on the renewal of this executive order. It's not being covered at all. It's really quite impressive. You rarely see something where there's only really one or two articles on the topic and the White House statement. So it really flies under the radar, especially because these sanctions are not new. They're being renewed. But, it really flies under the radar that Biden is not changing anything at all about this policy of sanctions on Venezuela. So the people of the US really don't know. They don't know. I think it's fair to say the people of the US don't really know anything about sanctions. They don't. That's not a topic that's in our news. That's something that people take for granted or people simply don't know about. So when it poses a huge issue, right? Because when people see that there are people seeking asylum from Venezuela, they're automatically assuming that it's because of the socialist government and not because of sanctions, when in fact it is because of sanctions, right? So, that being said, there is also, movements in the United States, social movements in the United States that are anti-imperialist, that do in fact keep up with the news on sanctions, that do try to educate themselves, right? But it's something that, a lot of people do have to be involved in these movements to even know about what's going on. But there was a massive Venezuela solidarity march in Washington, D.C. in 2019. So there are movements that are addressing these issues, but it really is only in the social movements that you find like a real knowledge on US sanctions.
All right. We'll leave it at there on this story, Natalia, but we'll be back with you in a minute because we're talking about, of course, insulin prices being capped in the US and maybe ending the show today on a slightly more positive note.
Okay.
And finally, after months and a lot of public pressure, Eli Lilly, a major pharmaceutical manufacturer, has decided to cap the price of insulin at $35 a month. This will have a massive impact on around several million diabetes sufferers in the United States, allowing particularly working class people to be able to access the life-saving drug. Natalia is still with us and has more details on this major win for the public health movement. There some celebrations, Natalia, from some sections of the US government, policymakers, etc. How big of a win is this?
Yeah, so a pharmaceutical giant, Eli Lilly, has cut insulin prices, has capped them at $35, which is really incredible. And I think a lot of working class people in the US are rejoicing because insulin has been so expensive and unaffordable for a very long time. This cut reduces the price by 70%. And so, people with diabetes in the United States, working class people, diabetes is largely a working class illness. People are really rejoicing because finally they'll be able to afford, a drug that is necessary for life. Like it's not like you would die without it if you, have certain types of diabetes. So, people are really rejoicing. And, in the United States, people have been, there's 30 million people who have diabetes in the US, 7 million who rely on insulin. There have been many notable deaths in the past years from people who couldn't afford insulin and so had to dangerously ration their insulin. Very young people who had a life ahead of them who simply, just couldn't afford a life-saving drug. In 2022, a study was done that found that 1.3 million people are rationing insulin because of prices. The study estimated that insulin cost around $1,000 a month for people with diabetes. So you can imagine, combined with gasoline prices, inflation in the United States is skyrocketing. Rent is also skyrocketing. So, combined with all of those cost of living issues, the price of insulin was simply, unaffordable. People could not afford it. And there has been a lot of controversy for a very long time. Really the companies, the corporations have responded to public pressure and in doing this.
In that context, Natalia, are we likely to see other manufacturers following suit? Will this have a wider impact on, the pricing of drugs and the sort of fight against big pharma, which controls how many of these drugs are priced around the world?
Yeah. So there are two sort of notable reasons that Eli Lilly, the company, did this. Well, one of them, is not necessarily like a direct reason, but it's very related to the pushback against the company, right? So, I don't know if you remember on Twitter when Elon Musk made it that everyone could just buy a blue check mark. Someone was impersonating this company, Eli Lilly, and tweeted that insulin was free now. And the stock of the company tanked after that. That comes only a few months before this move to make insulin, capped at $35. So many people are saying that that's linked, this sort of funny incident that happened, but also that the Inflation Reduction Act, also is regulating the price of insulin now. So under Medicare, under the Inflation Reduction Act, if you're on Medicare, then which is public health insurance for elderly people in the US, there is a $35 a month ceiling on insulin. And now Eli Lilly, this company, is essentially making this like a more far-reaching cost cut. So they're responding from public pressure and also pressure from the government. There are a few other pharmaceutical giants that also produce insulin that they could also respond in this way. Probably will, just because of the rules of competition, right? I think that there is a lot of pressure in the US on pharmaceutical companies in general to not exorbitantly raise prices, although they still do very often. But it is very controversial. I think that this move, it bodes well for the movement for more accessible healthcare, for Medicare for all, and just the fight against giant pharmaceutical companies, right? I mean, healthcare in the United States is extremely, extremely expensive. I mean, I think it's become sort of like a international, joke almost, that like healthcare in the US is like you just can't, afford to get sick. You can't
Yeah.
afford to go to the hospital,
Yeah.
even though so many working class people do get sick, obviously. So, I think that there's a larger movement to limit healthcare costs. And this, I think bodes well for the movement in terms of like the effectiveness of public pressure. Because I mean, like, affordable healthcare is a very, very popular issue in the United States, right? Conservatives, leftists, I mean, the people of the US largely do want more affordable healthcare. So it is very possible that this is just portending other price caps to come, which is my sincere hope. But yeah, it's very good news for the people of the US.
All right. So we'll bring the episode to a close on that good bit of news. Natalia, thanks very much for your time and for talking to us about both these stories today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, we'll be back tomorrow with a weekend final episode of the Daily Debrief. Until then, as always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories as well as all of the other work we do. Don't also forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.